So how do you do that? How do you have greater enforcement?
Well, the thing that was quite interesting to me is when I first started at the Justice Department, we had this, quite interesting challenge, which I was traveling around the country and you'd see these prosecutors and agents who seemed like, wow, working a trafficking case, that's a pretty morally compelling thing to work on. If that's out there, I'd like to, that's the kind of case I'd like to work on. And yet we were seeing very few cases and we're trying to figure out what's the disconnect. We've got good laws. We've got smart, motivated prosecutors and agents. Why are we not seeing more cases? And what we discovered is it's a very specialized area of law enforcement. And that's not that unusual, but normally when you have a specialized area of law enforcement, you create a specialized unit. So you'll have a narcotics unit or an organized crime unit that's going to focus on a specialized area of crime. Well, what happens when the enforcement of the crime is still so new that there's just no one down the hall? I can't walk down the hall and say, hey, Peter, you're our expert on trafficking cases. How do you do this? How do we even start? How do we go find this stuff? And when there's no one down the hall, you don't want to screw up professionally, especially when there's a bunch of very traumatized victims on the other end. And so the cases weren't happening. So what we did is we worked together at the Justice Department with some other federal agencies to create a pilot. We went to the 94 federal districts in the U.S. and we said, hey, you guys compete for 6 slots that will participate in the pilot. And those pilot districts will do 3 things. First, we'll just kind of almost build a mini specialized unit. Here's our team. Here's our prosecutors. Here's our federal agents. We're now going to work on trafficking cases. And then secondly, we'd walk them through, here's the strategies and interventions and tools that we've seen that actually are effective. And then the third thing is they'd go back to their home districts and we'd pair them up with me or another prosecutor in our national unit, and we'd fly out there and just roll up our sleeves and start working cases together. And of course, there's all kinds of problems that come up that you never anticipated in the classroom, but now at least you have someone with you who can help you push through those problems and move your cases forward. So 2 years in, we pulled the data to see, okay, has this made a difference? And what we discovered is that those 6 pilot districts had really hit it out of the park. So we saw a 114% increase in the number of traffickers charged in the pilots compared with 12% in the rest of the country. In fact, those 6 districts had produced more convictions than the other 88 federal districts combined. So we're like, okay, this is working. And that's slowly spreading in the US, but where it was not spreading was in developing countries where 93% of the world's victims were. And that's what really motivated me to leave the Justice Department and launch Human Trafficking Institute to really try to solve that problem, to take that successfully piloted model that we'd seen work well in the US to countries that had really good anti-trafficking laws, who were motivated to increase enforcement, even for self-interested reasons, and we could talk more about that in a second, but just didn't have access to the model or the expertise to do it. So that's what we do now at Human Trafficking Institute. We now partner with developing countries essentially to do those same 3 things. We help them vet and build specialized units, walk them through some very concrete skills training and strategy training, and then I hire former FBI agents, former prosecutors who move to that country and by agreement with the government begin to work directly with those units day in and day out on their cases, helping them build their skills, solve case-related challenges, and also create that transparency and accountability that helps protect against corruption risk. And then we measure that from start to finish to see if it's working.
That's quite a big move, though, to go and create the Human Trafficking Institute. How did you even start? I mean, because I guess one of the key issues is funding.
Yeah, it was. I'm not going to lie, Peter. That was the big hang up, because for a decade at the Justice Department, I had the IRS as my fundraiser, and they were really good at it. I mean, they raised our money without fail. I knew I had a travel budget at the Justice Department without fail. But leaving to launch Human Trafficking Institute and having a bunch of friends who were sort of government lawyers or NGO people, I knew they weren't going to fund it. They're just trying to get food on the table, get their kids in school. And so, and I didn't have like a great network for that. But at some point we felt like, gosh, my co-founder and I felt like we vetted this idea long enough. Like we know this is a huge need that honestly, even if governments are super motivated to increase trafficking, they can shout down the chain of command to police and prosecutors and judges to get this fixed all they want. But if the police and prosecutors at the bottom of the chain are going, it's actually quite specialized, we don't know how to do this. It's like putting $1 billion on the table and telling you or me to go do cataract surgery, right? At that point, it doesn't matter how smart we are or how well motivated we are or how incentivized we are. We just don't have the skills to do it. And we realized until you solve that problem, globally, we can pour trillions of dollars into anti-trafficking efforts and see almost no reduction in the prevalence of trafficking. So, and that's actually the one narrow thing that we know how to do. So let's take a risk and go do it. So I left to try and raise some seed capital. And I was just profoundly bad at it, I discovered, or judging by the results. And then we were just very fortunate to have one or two people that came through early on and took a massive risk on us that just gave us enough runway to really have things take off.
So do you run it as a business or a nonprofit?
It's a nonprofit.
It's a nonprofit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a lot harder, I think, to raise for a nonprofit than it is to raise for a technology company in Silicon Valley.
For sure. I remember sitting next to us, I was at a conference with a private equity guy who was sitting on my left, and he said, "Oh, what do you do?" I said, "Oh, I'm trying to raise the seed capital. Here's what I'm trying to do." He's like, "Oh, what are you trying to do in year one?" I said, "We're trying to raise $1 million in the first year." He looked at me. He said, "You got to rework this. That will never work." He said, I produce amazing returns at my private equity firm. It's hard for me to raise $1 million. You're doing a philanthropic, return, like that's super, super hard. Like, people relying on the goodness of people's hearts to get $1 million is just a huge challenge. And so it's actually been quite amazing to see that there are just a lot of people who, I think, if you look at all the issues that we talk about, there's almost always a vocal opposition. Often the debate is, should we or shouldn't we do this thing? And I can't think of a social issue almost really right now where there's not a hot debate, except this. This is like the one thing where there's no longer any debate about should we or shouldn't we stop
I'm
this.
pro-trafficking.
Right. There's no pro-trafficking contingency that we don't want to offend.
Yeah.
And so the debate has fundamentally shifted to, okay, well, we all think this should stop. The question is, can we and how? And now for the first time, we've got really proven models that are measurably stopping traffickers. And I think, in my mind, going back to that divided soul kind of experience of like, one part of you is like, this has to stop, and the other part's like, it's too big, nothing will change. What you really need, the thing that actually restores those two halves of your soul is this sense of like very tangible hope. Like, A is doable, B is doable, C is doable, and collectively they result in not just a few victims being protected, but in massive drops in the prevalence of trafficking. And that really didn't exist when I learned about this 20 years ago, but it does now. And so I think, especially for those of us with significant circles of influence like you, I think this is an opportunity where we get to have a front row seat to, for the first time in history, watching widespread human trafficking fall at scale. Okay. And to me, that's a pretty exciting thing to be a part of.
And my assumption, it is a problem that has been growing.
It's very hard to measure the growth of it because
you don't know where it is.
So hidden.
Yeah.
Now, we do have numbers. So we know that roughly there's 25 million victims today that are in some version of either sex or labor trafficking. Now, that's a cross-section number because what happens is traffickers just churn through victims. So they acquire new victims, they discard old victims. And so the actual number of people victimized is way, way, way higher than that. But that number can feel so debilitating if you don't have like if you don't have tangible hope, if there's not like a very clear solution that can begin to address this at scale.
How long's the Institute been running?
So I left in 2015 to launch the Justice Department, to leave the Justice Department and get this launched.
7 years.
So yeah, 6-7 years.
And so how big's the operation now?
So we have 22 folks globally, but we operate through, so just to give you one concrete example, one of our partner countries is Uganda. So we work with the government of Uganda, which commits to build not just a specialized unit, but an entire new human trafficking department within the police force that they commit to staff with 250 police and staff. And then they allow us by agreement to operate inside that criminal justice system and drive cases forward through their own police and prosecutors. And so that's really one of the reasons why we're able to see such outsized impact, is though our team is relatively small, is very small relative to the impact numbers that we're seeing, we're operating through this much larger group of people who ultimately are going to own this, right? So this is the goal, is to ultimately create self-sustaining enforcement capacity so that when these units can hit performance benchmarks and handle normal attrition, then Uganda is fully funding its own self-sustaining units. So you get all the ongoing protection with no additional philanthropic investment.
And do any of the governments actually financially contribute towards what you're doing? Can you get funds from them?
Yeah, so in the first round, our commitment to what we've asked for our partner countries to do is to say, hey, you have to form these new units, and you've got to take your own people, assign them to these units, fund all their salary and all their benefits from day one, and you've got to find your own money to backfill the slots they vacated by that transfer, which is actually quite a big ask for these poor country, for economically poorer countries. And then we'll take care of the rest. Now, I think in 5 years, you could go to a country that is, for instance, there are countries right now who are on the precipice of getting sanctioned because of their human trafficking practices And let's say they're looking at $100 million sanctions risk. If we can help reduce that sanctions risk by 50%, that's a $50 million value proposition. So I think you could begin to say, hey, countries, it's actually more expensive for you not to solve the problem than to use this replicable model to solve it. And that's where you start getting funding at scale. So this is what, right now, we're kind of in this critical period over the next 5 to 10 years where we're proving out that this model actually works not just in the US, but in these very different countries and continents and contexts is critical data to help drive this to scale.
It's the impact that you can have globally in the scale of the impact you can have currently limited by your budget.
Yeah, I would say there's two limiting factors. The biggest is funding.
Yeah.
And philanthropic funding is just much less efficient capital distribution right now than other forms of funding, which is honestly one of the reasons why it's pretty exciting to see, and I think this gets underplayed in the press, but to see like the Bitcoin community becoming actually this dominant engine of philanthropy on the planet.
Yeah.
I mean, people think about the Bitcoin community outside of it as, but isn't Bitcoin associated with crime? And it has sort of this sort of negative reputation of being illicit or kind of dark in some way. And yet here you have all this Bitcoin wealth, and you have this community that's energized by building something that accomplishes something huge in a short period of time for the cause of human freedom. And so I think about that group, and I think about here now we have this proven model that can actually dramatically increase the number of traffickers stopped and victims protected. And I think this is where I could imagine, in 5 years, what if the Bitcoin community actually became famous for being the driving force behind bringing human freedom to trafficking at scale across the globe? I mean, that would be, as Bitcoin tries to gain broader adherence and more widespread adoption, hyper-Bitcoinization, I think, depends on having a shift among the larger public that isn't getting to listen to your podcast, who's still a little bit on the fringes of what is this all about? It feels very different. It feels new. I'm not so sure about it. Isn't it associated with crime? To see, hey, this is actually a group that's at the forefront of decimating something like modern slavery in a measurable way. That's the kind of thing that gets me excited. And when you look at the giving trends of the Bitcoin community, what's interesting is they're not like the traditional philanthropic community. They're not really interested in symphony tickets or the art. I mean, they're looking at where are there sort of game-changing impacts that, if they were scaled, would have world-changing effects and have world-changing effects for human freedom. And it's very, very interesting to read about that social movement that's really going underappreciated of Bitcoin driving the face of philanthropy in a totally different way.